Hello, my name is James Nagy. Thank you for watching my video series, The End of the End Times. This is the second half of part 4 of my presentation, which is a 10-part series based upon my book, also titled The End of the End Times. In this episode, we're going to primarily be focused upon the so-called 70th week of Daniel. And the reason for that is that this passage in the book of Daniel was written during one of the kings of the Persian Empire. So some of the events that we're going to be looking at actually have their sighting or take place during the times of the Persian Empire. Now, I will say, before we jump into this, there's a lot of material here. There's only several slides, but we're going to cover a lot of material. And I want to say right from the start that many of you have probably been taught certain elements about the 70th week of Daniel and passages in the book of Daniel, especially chapter 9. And you've probably been taught that the passage we're going to look at refers to a future end times or a future 7-year tribulation period. And it's my hope to show you that the passage in question, the 70th week of Daniel, is not describing events that are still in our future, but that they refer to events that have already happened. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And we're going to be looking at the passage in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And I'm going to go ahead and read to you the passage from the New International Version. So it reads as follows. 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets in a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So, let's go ahead and pick apart this passage verse by verse. And let's start off with verse 24. So I have a table here, and what it does is it lists the key elements of each verse in the passage. So starting with verse 24, we see that there are 70 weeks decreed to finish transgression, to end sin, to atone for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now, as we study this list, it should be obvious to us that the descriptions here could only ever be fulfilled through the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. So this verse isn't talking about a time, an era of humanity that is free from sin, but rather it's describing a time when transgression and sin and iniquity has been dealt with for once and for all. There's been an atonement for iniquity. And this could only happen through the finished work of Jesus on the cross through his death, burial, and resurrection. So verse 24 is a very obvious reference to Jesus, the Messiah himself. So let's go ahead and look at the next 3 passages. So in verse 25, we see that Jerusalem shall be rebuilt for 69 weeks in troubled times, starting with the decree to build the city. Well, the question is, which decree is verse 25 talking about? And that is specifically the focal point of this whole presentation. We're going to see that there's actually 3 decrees that Daniel could possibly be referring to, and we're going to look at each one of them in detail and see if we can determine which decree is being described in verse 25. Now in verse 26, we see that after 483 years, an anointed one shall be cut off. So I want to make a point here. The 69 weeks in verse 25, it's generally accepted that in the Daniel passage, a week is really representative of a period of 7 years. So some of your Bible translations might say 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Some of them might just combine them together into 69 weeks, but the 69 weeks is really a period of 69 times 7, or 483 years. So after 483 years, an anointed one shall be cut off. The people of a prince who is to come shall destroy Jerusalem, and there shall be war and desolation. Now, a point about verse 26. When it says an anointed one shall be cut off, the word in the Hebrew for anointed one is used only twice in the Bible, and both times in the Daniel passage that we're looking at here. And the word can actually mean a king, a prince, or a Messiah, lowercase m. So the point I'm trying to make here is that even though some of your translations might say Messiah, the word that's being used could also equally be describing a king or a prince, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a reference to Lord Jesus. It could be, but it's not necessarily stating that it's a reference to Lord Jesus. And then also, I'm going to show you that in verse 26, when it talks about the people of the prince, that I hope to show you that this is a reference to the Roman Empire. So the people of the prince who is to come is a reference to the Roman Empire, as we shall see. And then finally, let's look at verse 27. In verse 27, it says that a prince shall make a strong decree for 7 years. The prince shall end sacrifice and offering. And finally, there shall be an abomination that causes desolation. And I'm going to show you that verse 27 is not a reference to a future 7-year tribulation or modern end times, but rather these are describing events that occurred during a 7 years Roman-Jewish war that occurred from AD 66 to 73. And that war is going to be our focal point 2 episodes from now when we study the Roman Empire. Now let's look at the 3 decrees in detail, because again, we're trying to make sense out of verse 25 and decide, well, which decree was Daniel talking about when he said there was going to be a decree? Well, there's actually 3 of them, and they're all mentioned in the book of Ezra. And let's look at each one of them. So the first decree was issued by Cyrus the Great, and that was in 537. And the purpose of that decree was to rebuild the house of the Lord. A second decree came a short time later in 520 BC that was issued by Darius I. And the purpose of that decree was to reaffirm the Cyrus decree. So it was not a new decree, it was a reaffirmation of the Cyrus decree that was issued earlier. The third decree from Ezra 7, chapter 7, was issued by King Artaxerxes of Persia. And the purpose of this decree was to provide money and furnishings to the Jewish people for the house of the Lord. All right, so with this information in mind, let's look at the 3 decrees on a timeline, because the relative position in terms of time and history of each decree relative to when the Jewish temple was rebuilt is very important to our analysis. So let's go through this. So the 3 diamonds show the 3 decrees: Cyrus in 537, Darius in 520, and Artaxerxes in 458. And then we also see in the red diamond that in 516 BC, the Jewish temple was rebuilt, or at least it was put into operation. So of the 3 decrees, the Cyrus decree would certainly be the most famous. And I want to make another point here. Daniel 9, the chapter 9 that we're studying, would likely have been written in 536 BC. So this would be a year after the Cyrus decree was issued. So just simply in terms of timing and the magnitude of the event, the Cyrus decree would certainly be the most famous, because Daniel wrote that passage shortly after the Cyrus decree. And from the point of view of the Jewish exiles who had been living in Babylonian captivity and now find themselves living in the Persian Empire, the decree to return to Israel would certainly be the most significant of the 3 decrees. Now, for a time, after the Cyrus decree, Persia forbid the completion of the temple it was halted from a king who came after Cyrus. And then the construction was renewed under Darius I. So what happens is, for a time, the work on the temple is halted. Darius finds the decree of Cyrus, and he reaffirms the decree. in 520, and then 4 years later, the temple is actually rebuilt, or like I said, put into operation. So from this point of view, the Darius decree would also be significant in terms of when Daniel 9 was written. Now, even though the Darius decree came after Daniel 9 was written, several years later, it would be significant from the point of view that when Darius issued his decree, which was really a reaffirmation of the Cyrus decree, it was during the reign of Darius that the Jewish temple was constructed and put into operation. So far, both the Cyrus decree have a very strong relevance, as does the Darius decree. Now, what about the Artaxerxes decree? So the Artaxerxes decree was issued in 458 BC, and this is 58 years after the completion of the temple. Well, this is important because if you look at the timeline, you can see that when the Artaxerxes decree is issued in 458 BC, the temple had already been put into operation for 58 years. So even though the Artaxerxes decree was significant and that King Artaxerxes provided a large amount of silver and gold and other furnishings to complete the work on the Jewish temple, by this time the temple has already been rebuilt and put into operation for some period of time. Now, some argue that the decree in Daniel 9:25 to restore and rebuild Jerusalem refers to the Artaxerxes decree based on their assertion that Jerusalem was rebuilt during the time of Artaxerxes, and that is true. However, the decree makes no reference to rebuilding Jerusalem at all, simply the temple. And as we see, Artaxerxes provided silver and gold, quote, for the temple of their God in Jerusalem, that's from Ezra 7:16, for worship in the temple of your God, that's from Ezra 7, verse 19, anything else needed for the temple of your God, that's from Ezra 7:20, and for the temple of the God in heaven, that's from Ezra 7:23. Now, it would be naive to assume that the Jews who were returning to Jerusalem were not also rebuilding parts of the city as well as the temple, for example, their houses and roads and other things. So the only point I'm trying to make here is, so far, according to our analysis, we haven't been able to definitively say that it was which of the three decrees Daniel 9:25 is talking about. We still have three strong contenders. There's strong reasons to support any one of the three decrees at this point. So let's continue our analysis from a slightly different angle. Let's go ahead and take each decree, and what we're going to do is we know that there's going to be an event that happens 69 weeks or 483 years later. There's going to be an anointed one who is cut off and left with nothing. So let's take the three decrees and add 483 years and see where this ends, where we end up in Jewish history. Well, let's start out with Cyrus. If we start out with his decree and add 483 years, this puts us at 54 BC. Now, there's nothing extraordinary going on in the nation of Israel in 54 BC, at least nothing that would tell us definitively who the anointed one, the prince, or the people of the prince is. We'll come back to the Darius decree in a minute because that's going to require additional analysis, but let's go ahead and look at the Artaxerxes decree. Now, if we add 483 years to the year of the Artaxerxes decree, this puts us at AD 26. And as we know, that's about the time of the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So if we accept the Artaxerxes decree as the one being described in Daniel 9:25, then clearly the anointed one is Jesus. I will say that the passage that says the anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing, that's a rather shallow, unextraordinary way to describe the death of Jesus. However, some contend that nevertheless, even with that rather shallow description of an anointed one being cut off and left with nothing, that many people believe that Jesus is in fact the anointed one. Now, if this is true, then the prince is likely going to be a man named Titus, and we're going to learn a great deal about him shortly. I don't have much to say about him presently because I don't want to detract from the central theme of the Daniel passage. But suffice it to say for the time being that Titus is a Roman general under whose authority the Jewish temple is going to be completely destroyed in AD 70, and the city of Jerusalem practically burnt to the ground. So he would very likely be our prince if we accept Artaxerxes as the issuer of the decree in 925, Daniel 925. And then necessarily, if we accept Titus, and even with the timing of Jesus' ministry, the people of the prince who is to come is certainly a reference to the Roman Empire. So we're talking about the Romans. Now, as I said, we're going to circle back to the Darius decree, but this is going to require some additional analysis. So before we can look into the Darius decree, we're going to have to immerse ourselves for a time in the events surrounding the Hasmonean Dynasty, which ruled Israel from 140 BC to 37 BC, a period of roughly 100 years. So I'm going to go to the next slide here, and then we'll come back to the previous slide shortly. Now, I would encourage you to print out this slide. It's going to become very important and very useful to us, not only in this lesson, but also when we study the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. We're going to make continuous reference to this slide. So let's see what's going on here. Some of these names you aren't familiar with, but hopefully by the end of this and the next two lessons, you'll recognize many of these names. So what was the Hasmonean Dynasty? Well, the Hasmonean Dynasty began with a man named Mattathias. He was a Jewish man who had 5 sons who were known as the Maccabees. Now, Mattathias himself died around 166 BC, but like I said, he had 5 sons known as the Maccabees. The most famous of these was Judas Maccabees, who led a revolt against Greece. Many of you have probably heard the account about how Antiochus Epiphanes slaughtered a pig and shed the blood of the pig on the temple of the Lord. And later on, the Maccabees led a revolt against the Greeks, and eventually were able to overthrow the Greek powers that were trying to rule over the Jewish nation. They re-cleansed the temple. And then after that, there was the celebration of lights, or the Festival of Lights, to mark the cleansing of the temple and the restoration of the temple. So it's a very famous event in Jewish history, and we're going to talk about that in the next lesson. But just know for now that these 5 sons of these 5 Maccabees are very important figures in Jewish history. Now, another son, Simon, was the father of John Hyrcanus, as you see in the chart here. Now, John Hyrcanus did something which is going to have extremely grave and significant consequences for the nation of Israel later on when we study the Roman Empire. What he did was he forced Judaism on the neighboring Idumeans. Now, the Idumeans were formerly known as the Edomites, so the nations are synonymous. And like I said, this is an act that will have serious consequences for the Jews later on. Now, what's going on here in the Hasmonean Dynasty? We're not going to get too involved in this for the time right now. We'll come back to it later. But during the Hasmonean Dynasty, the nation of Israel is growing weaker and weaker due to internal infighting, internal politics. And what happens is the nation gets weaker and weaker, and this man named Herod steps up, and he is desiring to rule over Israel. Now, Herod was a man that you probably know him from the first chapter of Matthew. He's mentioned early on in the book of Matthew. This is the Herod that tried to kill the baby Jesus. He was unsuccessful, thank the Lord, but he was the one who tried to murder the baby Jesus by having all the male children slaughtered in Bethlehem. Well, he was favored by the Roman leaders, and Herod himself claimed to be Jewish. Now, whether he was actually ethnically Jewish or not, we don't definitively know, but we do know that at least he identified with Judaism, and he wanted to become king over Israel. So over time, as the nation of Israel is growing weaker and weaker, Jerusalem falls to the combined armies of Herod and the Romans. Now, if you look at the chart here, you see a man named Antigonus, and he's kind of at the bottom of the bluish region. You can see he dies in 37 BC. Well, Antigonus is the very, very last and final king who is ever going to rule over the nation of Israel. And during this fighting, Antigonus was captured by Antony. This is the famous Antony from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, for those of you who are Shakespeare fans, history buffs. Now, several of Antigonus's closest friends were executed, and Antigonus himself was beheaded in 37 BC. And as I said, he was the last king to ever rule over Israel. And a little point here that we're going to look at again when we get to our study of the Roman Empire. A man named Octavian is going to go on to defeat this Antony, who had Antigonus put to death. And this Octavian is going to go on to become Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of the Roman Empire. So with all this information in hand, let's go back to the previous slide and continue our analysis. Now let's go back and look at the events surrounding the Darius decree. So we see that if we start with Darius and we add 483 years, this puts us at 37 BC, which is the year that King Antigonus is beheaded. And at this point, with this event in history, Israel now is under Roman rule, and basically Israel is no longer an independent nation until the year 1948. So this is a very significant event in Jewish history. Now, if we accept Darius as the decree in Daniel 9, verse 25, as I said, the anointed one would certainly be Antigonus. And remember I said the anointed one does not have to be the Messiah. It could simply be a king or a prince, somebody who is anointed. Now, in this case, the prince could very likely be Herod. Now, his title wasn't specifically prince, but he held power and authority that would be commonly associated with somebody who was a prince. And so Herod could be the prince described in the passage. But since as of 37 BC, Israel is now under Roman control, Titus could still be the prince because we're talking about a future prince who's going to rule over the land that includes Israel. So that does not exclude Titus from our analysis. So Titus still could be the prince that was described in the passage. Regardless, though, the people of the prince, again, are certainly the Romans, because this puts us smack right in the middle of Roman influence over the nation of Israel. So, in summary, what we see from the chart here is that if we start with Cyrus, we can't really pinpoint who the anointed one, the prince, or the people of the prince is. But if we start with either the Darius or the Artaxerxes decree, we have a very strong candidate for the anointed one. It's either going to be Antigonus, King Antigonus, who was the last king to rule over Israel, or it's going to be Jesus. And the prince, as I said, is either going to be Herod or this general Titus, who's going to go on to become the 10th emperor of the Roman Empire. And finally, most importantly, the people of the prince is going to be the Romans. So we're talking about the Romans or the Roman Empire. So that's what's going on here with all these events. So let's go ahead and wrap this all up. So in conclusion, the anointed one in verse 25 is ambiguous and can refer to a ruler or a prince as well as the Messiah. There is not sufficient context in the Daniel passage itself to definitively state that the verse refers to the Messiah. Regardless, though, of who the prince is, the people of the ruler in verse 26 is clearly a reference to the Romans. This is true whether we begin with the Artaxerxes decree or the Darius decree, as both place the 69 weeks within the context of Rome or the Roman Empire. As we shall see 2 lessons from now, the Roman Emperor Titus is going to put an end to the sacrifices at the midpoint of a 7-year Roman-Jewish war. And then during the Roman-Jewish war, the Jewish rebel leaders, as we will see, will shed the blood of innocent men in the temple of the Lord in fulfillment of verse 27. This is the abomination of desolation that we're going to look at when we get to our study of the Roman Empire. And I want to point out here, this is also supported by Eusebius. Now, Eusebius is considered the father of church history. Much of what we know about the early church in the 1st and 2nd centuries come from the writings of this Eusebius, and I'm going to quote him subsequently in future lessons as well. But this Eusebius writes that concerning these events that were going on, quote, "The last scene of all, when the abomination of desolation announced by the prophets was set up in the very temple of God, once world-renowned, when it underwent utter destruction and final dissolution by fire." All right, so a lot of information here. Like I said, I hope this shows, and we're going to see more evidence that that the Daniel 9 passage is really referring to events that occurred during the Roman-Jewish War that occurred from AD 66 to 73. So I hope this was both interesting and informative, and please join me next time in episode 5 when we look at the Greek Empire. Thanks for joining.